On a quiet morning in Tokyo in 1995, government officials released a number most people ignored. Japan's public debt had crossed 100% of its entire economy. There were no protests, markets did not panic. Daily life continued as usual. This story takes place in Japan, beginning after World War II, and it explains how government debt slowly became a permanent part of the country's financial system. By the end of this video, you will understand how Japan learned to live with debt, and why that choice still shapes its economy today. At the time, many Japanese families were focused on ordinary concerns. Mortgage payments, school fees, saving for retirement. Few imagined that decisions made decades earlier inside ministries and central banks would quietly influence their future. According to archived records, Japan did not fall into debt because of a single crisis. It happened step by step, policy by policy, year after year. One retired factory worker later recalled that interest rates kept falling, but prices did not rise the way they once had. He said it felt calm on the surface, but something seemed stuck underneath. If a country can borrow for decades without visible collapse, what does that really mean for its people? The story does not begin in the 1990s. It begins in the late 1940s, in a country rebuilding from ruins. Japan's cities were damaged, factories were silent. Families relied on ration cards and foreign aid. In 1949, Japan's Ministry of Finance took on a new role. It was not just collecting taxes. It was guiding recovery. According to archived records, strict controls were placed on spending, wages, and credit. The Bank of Japan became a quiet partner in this effort. It kept interest rates low. It ensured government borrowing remained affordable. This helped rebuild roads, ports, and factories. By the mid-1950s, growth returned. Exports rose. Household savings increased. Many believed the hard years were over. A former civil servant later described the mood as disciplined optimism. People trusted institutions. Debt felt temporary. It was seen as a bridge, not a burden. But one small detail was often overlooked. Most government bonds were being held inside Japan. Banks, pension funds, and insurers became long-term lenders to the state. If debt stays within a country, does it feel different from debt owed to the outside world? The first real shift appeared in the early 1970s. In 1971, global currency rules changed. Japan was forced to adjust its exchange rate system. This altered how money flowed in and out of the country. By 1973, oil prices surged. Japan imported nearly all of its energy. Costs rose quickly, growth slowed. According to archived economic reports, the government responded with spending. Public works expanded. Subsidies increased. Borrowing became a tool to smooth disruption rather than a temporary measure. Inside the Ministry of Finance, officials reportedly noticed a change in tone. Budgets were no longer about restraint. A small construction firm owner later recalled steady contracts during those years. Road repairs continued even as global markets struggled. For him, government spending felt protective. Debt began to shift from emergency support to routine policy. If borrowing prevents pain in the short term, does it quietly reshape long-term habits? What made this system work was something most people never saw. Japan created a closed loop between the government, banks, and savers. The government issued bonds regularly. Banks purchased those bonds. Households deposited their savings into those same banks. According to archived financial data, Japan's postal savings system played a major role. Millions of citizens placed their money into post office accounts. Those funds were then directed into government bonds. This meant the state was effectively borrowing from its own population. Interest payments stayed inside the country. There was no immediate pressure from foreign creditors. A former banker later explained that bond auctions felt routine. There was little debate. Demand was always there. For ordinary savers, the arrangement seemed safe. Deposits were protected. Returns were modest but reliable. Debt stopped feeling like a warning sign. It became part of the plumbing of daily finance. If borrowing is quiet and familiar, can it become invisible? The consequence did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded over many years. By the early 1990s, Japan's asset bubble had burst. Property prices fell sharply. Stock values collapsed. According to official statistics, government debt began rising faster than the economy. By 1995, it had reached levels once considered unthinkable. Yet interest rates kept falling. Inside financial institutions, executives reportedly expected inflation. It never came. Growth remained weak. A small business owner in Osaka later described how demand never fully recovered. Customers became cautious, expansion plans were delayed. The government responded with more spending. Infrastructure projects multiplied, borrowing increased again. Debt was no longer a tool to support growth. It became a way to prevent decline. If debt keeps an economy stable but stagnant, is that success or failure? By the late 1990s, the approach began to intensify. Japan entered a long period of weak growth and falling prices. Economists later called it deflation. According to Bank of Japan data, interest rates were lowered again and again. Eventually, they reached nearly zero. Borrowing became cheaper than ever. The government expanded stimulus programs. Public spending rose. Debt issuance increased almost every year. Inside policy circles, officials reportedly believed time was the solution. If conditions stayed stable long enough, growth would return. A municipal worker in northern Japan later recalled endless road projects. Bridges were repaired more than once. Employment was preserved, but demand stayed flat. By the early 2000s, Japan's debt had grown far beyond its annual economic output, yet markets remained calm. Confidence held. If pressure keeps building without an obvious breaking point, how long can balance be maintained? The strain finally became visible during the global financial crisis of 2008. While the shock came from abroad, Japan was already weakened. Exports fell sharply. Factories slowed production. Tax revenue declined. According to Ministry of Finance records, emergency spending was approved quickly. Debt issuance rose again. There was little debate. At the same time, the Bank of Japan expanded its role. It began purchasing government bonds directly. This step blurred the line between fiscal policy and monetary policy. A former central bank staff member later recalled that bond buying felt temporary at first. But each extension made the program harder to reverse. By the early 2010s, the central bank held a growing share of government debt. The system still functioned, but its balance depended on constant support. When stability requires continuous intervention, has the system already crossed its limit? Seen together, these events reveal a pattern that reaches beyond Japan. When growth slows, governments borrow to protect stability. When borrowing becomes routine, central banks step closer. According to historical records, similar paths appeared elsewhere. Italy relied on domestic bond buyers in the 1970s. The United States expanded central bank support after 2008. In each case, debt was not treated as an emergency. It was treated as infrastructure. Something to be maintained rather than reduced. Japan shows this pattern clearly. High savings funded government borrowing. Central bank purchases kept interest costs low. Time replaced reform. An academic observer once noted that nothing broke because nothing was allowed to move. Prices stayed flat. Wages stagnated. This pattern does not explode. It settles. If stability is preserved by freezing change, what quietly disappears in the process? Today, the effects of those earlier choices are still visible. Japan's public debt now stands at more than twice the size of its economy, yet borrowing costs remain low. According to recent government data, the Bank of Japan holds a large share of outstanding bonds. This keeps markets calm. It also ties policy choices closely together. For households, life feels stable but constrained. Savings earn little, wages rise slowly. A younger office worker in Tokyo later remarked that security feels permanent, but opportunity feels limited. Changing jobs is risky. Starting businesses feels harder than it once did. The past continues to shape expectations. Debt discourages sudden shifts. Policy favors continuity over disruption. Japan's experience shows how financial decisions can echo for generations, not through crisis, through persistence. When the future is shaped by protecting the past, what room is left for renewal? Japan's debt story is not a warning of sudden collapse. It is a lesson in endurance. Over decades, borrowing became a tool to avoid pain rather than to create change. Institutions adapted. People adjusted. According to archived comparisons, Japan chose stability at almost any cost. The economy remained orderly. But momentum faded. Other nations have faced similar choices. Some accepted disruption. Others chose protection. Japan shows what happens when protection becomes permanent. Debt stops being a bridge. It becomes a landscape. There is no dramatic ending to this story. Only a quiet question that remains unresolved. If a system works well enough to continue but not well enough to grow, What does success truly mean? Japan's experience invites a slower kind of reflection. It reminds us that financial systems rarely fail all at once. They evolve through choices that feel reasonable at the time. For many people in Japan, life remained orderly and predictable. That stability brought comfort. It also brought limits that were easy to accept and hard to escape. Stories like this are not just about one country. They are about how societies decide what they value most. If you enjoy calm explorations of history and finance like this, you may want to follow along for more stories. And I would be interested to know your thoughts. Do you think stability is worth the price Japan chose to pay?